Hi, my name is Liv Davis and I'm a volunteer here at RSPB Newport. When you are here, it is hard to imagine that once this was completely void of any nature or wildlife. Newport in South Wales is known for its industrial heritage and not really known for being very nature-based. It's really nice that there is this beautiful landscape here for people to come and escape and enjoy the beautiful wildlife. There is a lot of history surrounding the wetlands, and that is what I'm going to be investigating today in this short film. Can you introduce yourself and your role here at Newport Wetlands?
Yeah, my name's Jeremy. I'm one of the volunteer team here. I work mainly on the what we call kind of front of house, so it's meeting and greeting visitors coming to the reserve.
So can you explain a bit about what the RSPB is?
The RSPB is one of the UK's major wildlife conservation charities. In a nutshell, it's about giving nature a home.
What type of habitat is Newport Wetlands? So what kind of animals live here?
Because we're a mixture of habitats here, grazing fields which are often full of sheep, that's the sort of landscape going back hundreds of years. The nearby power stations, two coal-fired power stations in the 1950s, superimposed a couple of square miles of tips for the ash that comes out the back end of a coal-fired power station. The tips were converted in the late 1990s, early 2000s into the wildlife reserve here, and the majority of the reserve is either copses of woodland, scrubby woodland, or large expanses of reed bed, which is quite important and one of the largest areas of reed bed in South Wales. But we're surrounded as well on the seaward side by both salt marsh and mudflat, which are really very important habitats for things like wading birds.
So Newport Wetlands used to be a wasteland then?
This end of Newport Wetlands used to be a wasteland. In the sort of central part of it, it's wet meadows, which have been carefully managed for overwintering wildfowl. And at the far end, there's another much smaller reserve where you can go bird watching. And that was meadows, but was then turned into lagoons.
So what important species live here?
We get a range of species. There's huge lists of species, and it's not just birds. We get a nice variety of things like warblers living in and around the reed beds. In the winter, then we get overwintering wildfowl and waders, ducks, waders like curlew, black-tailed godwit, redshank. We have breeding marsh harriers. Now they're a reed bed specialist, so we have a couple of pairs there. Why are we so enthusiastic about those? Well, there are probably 500 or 600 breeding pairs in the whole of the UK, so having 2 breeding pairs here is actually quite an achievement. Our latest big success are breeding bitterns. Now, if you think a few decades ago that there were only 9 male bittern in the whole of Britain, then having 2 pairs now breeding is a terrific story of recovery for the species in the UK, and a terrific story for Newport Wetlands, being the only place in South Wales where they're breeding at the moment. Then we can't ignore things like plants and insects, of damselflies and dragonflies in the summer. We do well for butterflies, 22 species of butterfly during the course of a year here. And then we have plants. We have some marvellous plants. For example, we've got 5 different species of wild orchid, all of which moved themselves in after the reserve was created. And we have plants which are really important food species for some of our rarest insects. So we have the food plants that shrill carder bees particularly favour. So there are 6 places in the UK where you can expect to find shrill carder bee, and a lot of work goes into making sure that we actually preserve and help them to spread. One of the reintroductions that's managed to find its way from the introduction site 8 miles away to here are things like water voles, things like otters. We have a family of otters here. We have foxes, weasels, stoats, shrews, voles, that sort of thing. good range.
So there's obviously so much wildlife here. So why is it so important that wastelands are turned into wildlife havens like this?
If we go back to the point at which we had power stations here, generating ash, creating what was basically kind of a desert scape, a kind of a white moonscape, where there was nothing growing, there was no real wildlife in the middle of this part of the reserve, then you're faced with a couple of choices. Do you turn it into another piece of industry? Do you turn it into a great expense into housing? Or do you help nature to get a foothold back again? And the answer here was to actually work with nature and provide a place where we could tailor-make a reserve for particular species. So there were a number of species which we really wanted to provide a home for. Things like shoveler duck, things like teal, things like widgeon. And we had a few surprises, so we ended up with very significant numbers of things like black-toed godwit as well. They weren't on our list of target species, but we were awfully pleased to actually see them here. So what we've done is to take a place where there was next to nothing, and to take a place which is actually important to the extent where some of the species we now have nationally important numbers, which means that we have more than 1% of the national population here. So as well as being spread out sort of finely all around the coast, we actually have concentrations here because we've managed to create just the right sort of environment for them.
You spoke a lot about the history of Newport Wetlands. What's in store in the future?
So for the future of the wetlands, there are some bits that are sort of on the edge of the wetlands which are a little bit uncertain at the moment. For example, we have a gas-fired power station which replaced one of the coal-fired ones. The other things that are being planned at the moment are keeping the whole of the levels as an interesting and worthwhile destination, not just for wildlife but for people, and making sure that people understand our part of the environment of South Wales well enough to make sure that it's looked after properly.
Nature reserves like this are so important, especially in industrial landscapes like Newport. It increases biodiversity, which helps tackle the climate crisis, and it also helps species that are in decline. Many of our British species are in dramatic decline. An example of this would be the starlings. Starlings have seen a huge decline of 66% since the 1970s. Here, we can have up to 10,000 starlings over winter. That means from October to December, we are able to show the public the amazing displays that they put on. Showing the public the wonders of wildlife helps encourage a greater respect amongst people for wildlife and helps them understand the importance of giving nature a home.